Hi, I'm Ztarli, and in this video I'll be showing you how I use the selection tool and the clipping layers to create flat colors. So you'll need to have your line art ready to begin with, and I do like to change the color of the background before I proceed with choosing what colors my characters are. You do this by clicking the little circle at the bottom right, and you can select your different colors from here. You can also change the opacity of the background, so if you do want to have it that checkered pattern, which means it's completely transparent, you can change that as well. Now it's important to note that this is not part of your actual image, unless when you go to save it you select that you don't want a transparent background. So I'm purely using this color circle just as a backdrop whilst I'm coloring the character. When I actually go to save this image, I will select the transparent background, so it will completely ignore the color I have chosen on this little circle. I do like to choose a middle color, a neutral grey, right in the middle, before deciding on what colors to make my character, as I find this helps me decide on the right balance of light and dark colors. In the top right, we have the select tool. We have rectangle, ellipse, lasso, and wand. Lasso is the one that lets you draw around the shape that you want, and all of them will be standard set to replace mode, which means if you draw or select an area again, it will replace the original selection with the new one. You can change the selection modes up on the top bar. If you click on the add option, then you'll be adding to the selection. Subtract obviously takes away from it, and intercept will take the in-between selections, and the last one, exclude, will do the opposite of that. So it'll take out the middle piece that overlaps and leave you with the other two. Now I'm actually going to be using the wand select tool, as I want to select the area that needs to be flat colored as fast as possible. So we'll change it back to the replace mode, and then I'll change from lasso to the wand select option. Now I've tapped on the screen once and it has automatically selected all it could. Now you can see there's a few problems with my picture. It did get inside of the area I wanted to select. You can adjust how much leeway there is in its selection in this top right slider bar, so you might be able to get away with not having to adjust your line art by moving this slide bar up and down and seeing if you have it so it selects just the parts you need. I almost get there, but you can see the tail, there's still some parts of the tail that are being selected. So I could manually select this part, but instead I am actually going to fix up my line art. So I will go back in and just close up any gaps in the line art using the select tool as the hints of where those gaps in my line art may be. Now you'll see with the other selection tools, you don't actually have access to these slider bars. It's only the wand tool, as it is an automatic select tool, so it needs to know how much leeway you want to give it when you're doing the selection. So see here, I'm just very quickly closing up all these gaps in my drawing, and now I'm going to grab the wand tool again. It's still not great, but I'm super lazy, so I'm hoping if I slide this bar right down, I'll get what I want, and I do. So now I have the area outside of the dragon selected. Now I want to slightly adjust my selection, so I'm going to use this little icon at the top to change the amount of area that is selected, and you'll be presented with this slide bar that lets you expand or decrease the amount of area that is selected. And I just want it to be 1 pixel inside from that line art, so I'm just going to select the 1 and then hit the tick. Now if you've got thicker line art, you can probably go 2 or 3, but this line art's pretty thin, so it's going to be 1. Then I'm going to invert the area by clicking the invert button, so it is now selected the inside of the character and not the outside of the line art. So then I create a new layer in which I'll be putting my color on, and I grab the bucket tool and I put down my color. Now I have forgotten to deselect the area inside the tail, but no problem, you can just follow the same process and change the amount of area again just by that 1 pixel. hit the tick, and don't worry about inverting it this time because we actually want to remove that part. Go back to your color layer and just cut that part out of the picture. Now some of you might wonder why I hadn't inverted the selection right away and that I left it to the end to invert it. And that's not such a problem with a picture in the middle, but if you have a picture to the side like this, it does actually matter which way round you do it. So you see, at the moment I haven't inverted it, I've just got the outside selected and it still looks pretty okay. But if I invert it first and then move the slide bar, you'll see there begins to be a problem at the edge of the picture as it's bringing that selection in. Now when you put your color down, you're going to have this gap along the edge where the line art met the page. So it is better to do the selection and adjust the size of the selection before inverting your selected area. Now I'll show you the reason why I always bring my selection in a tiny bit before putting my color down. And that's because if you don't, there's always this tiny layer that makes it outside of the line art, as you can see here. Now it's really small, not very noticeable, but if you're applying blend modes to your layers, it becomes more and more visible. And erasing it manually is a real pain in the butt. At that stage, you might as well have manually painted around your picture to get the selection in the first place. A much easier way to fix this problem if you have forgotten to bring the selection in or you didn't know about that is basically the same process as before. You grab the wand tool and you select the area. This time I will remember to add the tail part, the tail circle in, by selecting the subtract because I just want to remove that part. And there is also a tiny gap between the legs that I missed as well. And then I'll adjust my selected area again. I'm going to make it 2 this time because I want to remove both the outside part and bring it in from the line art. Now that I have that selected, you don't actually need to invert it because we just want to cut the outside of the color off instead of adding color to it. So once you've got your selection, then we just go to the color layer and we'll just be selecting the cut at the top of the page there to cut off that extra layer of color. And there we go, it's all nice and neat again. No extra line around the outside, just the way I like it. Now we have our first flat color down on the page, you can actually start to make adjustments to the colors. So I normally choose a color close to what I like and then I like to adjust it and see if I can find something better or something that I find more pleasing. You can use the brightness contrast option, or you can use hue saturation, which is one of my favorites, which lets you control the saturation, the hue and the lightness all on the one panel. I find this is normally the best way to adjust just one color. It becomes a bit hard when you've got multiple colors on the same layer, as it will change all the colors on that layer. The other way you can adjust colors is through color balanced, but I find this is the opposite. It kind of just does the same thing that hue saturation does, but with midtones, highlights and shadow. And since there isn't any of that on here at the moment, I'm not individually affecting anything because there's just the one color here. So I tend to use the color balance option much later in the piece. I also tend to change colors or adjust colors once I have more than one on the page. So now we're going to add more colors to our flat color. And there are a couple of ways you can do this. My favorite way is to use the clipping layers, but if you don't have access to that, you can lock the layer by clicking on the little lock symbol on the layer you have selected. This will lock it so that you cannot paint outside the area that has already been painted. As you can see here, when I put my gold color across it, it's not painting outside of the area that has already been added to the layer. Now this becomes a problem if you want to adjust any of these colors individually. It is much harder to do so. The other thing you need to keep in mind is if your layer is locked and you use the erasing tool, it actually turns it black. It won't actually allow you to erase away. So if you need to erase anything, you need to remember to unlock the layer before doing so. Now I want to be able to freely adjust my colors no matter how many I have on here, so I'm going to use the clipping layer option. So to begin with, you have the base color on the very bottom, and all the layers above it with all your different colors are going to be your clipping layers. Now you see I've turned clipping off on this tan colored layer above it, and you can now see where I've been painting and it's clearly outside the lines. But if I click this little downward arrow, it will create a clipping mask or clipping layer, so that it will only affect the very next layer that is not a clipping layer, which is my green color underneath. So now I can freely erase both this layer and the layer below it. It won't turn black because the layers aren't locked, but I'm free to make adjustments without worrying about disturbing my original area that I have selected. So this does become a much better way to adjust colors, especially if you're not certain on what you want to use, and you can have as many clipping layers as you like above your base layer. So now I can freely change the colors of my layers independently of each other. So you can see here I can adjust the belly color and the main body of the dragon without them being on the same layer. You can choose whatever combination of colors you like. So if you want to make a small adjustment to one color but not the other, and you find that it's hard for you to decide on colors sometimes, this is going to be the best way for you to do this. You can see all of my colors are actually on clipping layers above the original one, so they can be easily changed. Now if you are to duplicate the base layer, it will actually always put it above the original layer and automatically make it a clipping layer. A similar thing will happen if you take a lower layer, which is currently not a clipping layer, and you slide it into position in between clipping layers. It will also automatically convert it into a clipping layer. Now you can actually turn off the clipping layer to create two base layers, and basically what you'll have is a bunch of clipping layers that only affect the base layer I've created in the middle, and then the clipping layers below it are now only affecting the base layer below them. So it always goes in order from top to bottom. Any clipping layer above will always affect the next normal layer below, and if you have a base layer in between, then it's not going to be affecting the very bottom layer. Now if you did want to make color adjustments to all of the colors at once on the one layer, you of course can still use clipping layers, just merge them together at the end to make your adjustments. You can use the same ways of adjusting as you could with the single layers. You can just select hue saturation, and you can see here it is affecting all the colors on the one layer, but you can get some interesting ideas by doing this. Like I really liked this woodland sort of feel I ended up with, and then just by changing the lightness you have a completely different feel to your dragon. I like this pastel-y look too, it's very sweet, and now I kind of want a dragon like this. You can also use the brightness and contrast. It basically just makes things bright and dark and turns up the contrast, or you can turn the contrast down, which kind of just makes it more grey or washed out looking. I don't use this very often. Generally I'll only use brightness and contrast if I just want to push some of the contrast a tiny bit, or if it's ended up a tiny bit too dark. The third option that I use is the color balance option. There is also curves, which I don't ever use, but color balance is my favorite one to use near the end of a picture, but you could use it at this stage as well. It essentially just allows you to change the color values in the middle tones, the highlights and the shadows individually. So you can see here I'm making it far greener and far more blue, and then I can adjust the darker colors individually or separately from the midtones, as well as adjusting the highlight colors as well. So I've gone from having this green and purple and gold dragon to instead having this more, I guess, ocean or sea themed dragon. So I always like to experiment with these colors, especially if you haven't settled on a character design yet, as you may come across something that you weren't expecting or something that it turns out you really like that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise. So always have a play around with colors. It's always lots of fun and you might find something new that you enjoy. Now I'll quickly go through one very last part, which is adding a clipping shading layer. Now I'll go through this in more detail in my blending modes video, but just to show you quickly here, I've created a multiply blending mode and I've just turned the opacity down, and this is a clipping layer, and I've chosen a dark like burgundy color and a softish brush, and I'm just adding my shadow layer onto this picture, and you can see it's very easy to do. It's quite effective very quickly, and if I wasn't happy with some of those edges, I'll just grab my smudging tool and I'll smudge it in. If you want to know more about blending modes and what the different blending modes do, then just check out my blending modes, how I use Artflow video. And that's it. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you found it helpful. If you did find it helpful or you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give me a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and I also have a Patreon if you'd like to support me. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!